Hello and welcome back to the Outdoor Minimalist podcast. I'm your host, Meg Carney, and I'm an outdoor and environmental writer and author of the book, Outdoor Minimalist, Waste Less Hiking, Camping, and Backpacking. Follow the link in the description to pre-order a copy of the book so you'll be the first to receive it on the release date of September 1st, 2022. The Outdoor Minimalist podcast has a goal to give listeners actionable ways to waste less hiking, camping, backpacking, and more during every step of the process. Your impact outdoors starts long before you hit the trail and goes beyond leave no trace ethics. You'll learn how to identify sustainable outdoor brands, how to ask hard questions regarding sustainability, and begin to shift and evolve your mindset to integrate minimalism into all of your outdoor pursuits. In episode 35 of the Outdoor Minimalist podcast, we are discussing what constitutes an ethical gear purchase and how consumers can make those decisions a little bit easier. If you remember, one of my earliest episodes featured Mary Swanson of Lava Linens, and she shed light on identifying sustainable product materials. And although this is a standalone episode and you'll learn a lot just from listening to this one, I do recommend going back and listening to episode 3, How to Identify Sustainable Product Materials, for even more tips on being a conscious consumer. To help break down how we as consumers can make more ethical purchases in every area of our life, but particularly if we love outdoor recreation, I'm excited to introduce Marie Wilson. Marie is an outdoor and environmental writer. Her writing focuses on the intersectionality of sustainability, climate action, and the outdoor industry. She works to make sustainability in the outdoors more accessible while also highlighting the environmental responsibility that comes with exploring outdoor spaces. Adventuring plans in your calendar? Remember to grab your Lava Linens travel towel on your way out the door. Founded by a mother-daughter team, Lava Linens crafts durable, luxurious travel towels for a more sustainable and better performing alternative to microfiber and cotton towels. Powered by flax and hemp, they're designed to be by your side for years to come. Use the code Outdoor Minimalist for 15% off your next order. Thank you for joining me today, Marie. I am excited that we connected, and especially since you are a fellow writer in the sustainability and outdoor industry space. But before we get into the episode topic, can you tell us a little more about yourself, how you got into outdoor recreation, and how it fits into your life today?
Yes. So hello, everyone. I'm Marie Wilson, and outdoor recreation has kind of been a part of my life for as long as I can remember. I was very fortunate to grow up in the Pacific Northwest outside of Seattle, kind of near Mount Rainier. So I spent a lot of my summers hiking in that area or trail running, and a lot of my winters going skiing. So it's just kind of something that has blossomed into a lifelong passion of mine. And it was when I was in college that I kind of began learning more about sustainability and just how there were so many aspects of our lives that were harming the planet. And through that, I ended up starting a blog and writing just for fun. And over time, I began to realize that all of these unsustainable practices that were just so jarring to me, a lot of them were still present within the outdoor industry. So that kind of led me down a rabbit hole to where I am today of continuing to write and try and bring awareness and education to people so that we can try and make the industry a little bit more sustainable.
That's awesome. I feel like my start to writing sounds really similar because I was noticing a lot of those discrepancies because I was like, why don't we care more about this in the outdoor industry? So
absolutely.
I am glad that you are focusing on those topics. So
yeah,
this episode, our main focus is discussing a lot of those things that probably drew you to writing in the first place. So how our gear is actually being produced, the general sustainability of that gear, and how people can make their gear last longer, because that tends to be a more sustainable route. So let's just start with the topic of how gear is produced. What would you say is a standard trajectory and impact of gear production?
Yeah, so when we talk about kind of the impact of our gear, I like to break it down into the environmental and social impacts. It's really easy to focus on, how is our gear being produced? What is it made of? Is it made of synthetic fabrics? And kind of how that pertains to the outdoors. But also understanding that practices such as fast fashion are still present within the outdoor industry. So what social impacts does that have? And really the impact of gear can range like so greatly based on the company that's producing it, the textiles that are being used, the means of production, how they're shipping things, how it's being sold and marketed. But really the impact is from the moment the idea is conceptualized, how it's produced, until the item is deemed no longer usable, which usually means it getting thrown away. So it's much more than just how is it made? It's from the start of its life to the very end.
So would that kind of fall into a life cycle analysis realm, you would say?
Yeah, definitely. Just all stages of it, I think, definitely play a role into the impact that it's going to have on the outdoors.
I know that it is kind of a broad question if you're asking, well, what is the impact of gear production? But if you were to take a really broad view of the outdoor industry, and you could even compare it to other industries, like you kind of mentioned fast fashion, even though it's integrated, how would you compare those impacts as far as gear production or product production, I guess I could say?
Yeah, I think that gear production and just like whether it's clothing or a tent can definitely be lumped into and as often into the fashion industry, which is one of like the leading contributors to climate change, like one of the major industries. And obviously some things are not made from textiles that we would normally think of, like our ice axe or something like that. But generally speaking, a lot of our gear and clothing and the majority of things we purchase kind of falls into the fashion industry, even if we don't, first thing we think of for fashion probably isn't outdoor gear. So it definitely has a massive impact in that regard. Obviously, there's a lot more organization in terms of the outdoor gear being produced, or just more awareness in general, because a lot of people in the outdoor industry do care about the planet and they're trying to minimize that impact. So it's tough to like put a number on it, but I would say it's much larger than people think because it can be included within kind of the fashion industry as a whole.
Yeah, I do think that I didn't really realize how much the industry really fell in with fast fashion until I started doing a lot more research. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. And since we're kind of talking about materials in general, are there any specific types of materials that you would say have a higher impact than others?
Yeah, I would say generally speaking, synthetic materials have a much higher environmental impact. And synthetic materials are super common within the outdoor industry. So items such as polyester or nylon, they're made from fibers that don't grow naturally. Oftentimes they're created by humans from like petroleum or gas. And in the outdoor industry, they can be found in everything from your running attire to shoes to backpacks to jackets, tents. Like so much of the gear we use is made from synthetic materials, whereas natural fibers tend to have a less of an impact coming from, bamboo or wool or cotton. And wool is probably, all of those are present in the outdoor industry, but wool is pretty common. And the ones that have the largest impact are going to be the virgin synthetic materials. So these are ones that are produced solely for that item. So one way to like minimize that in terms of synthetic materials is to use recycled synthetic materials. That way the means of production and the impact that comes from producing that material is kind of spread out over the course of numerous garments, if one is being repurposed into a new item or something like that. But for the most part, most of the gear we see on the market is going to be coming from that virgin synthetic material, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I plan on doing an episode about synthetic fabrics specifically and talking about like recycled polyester and things like that. And if people are interested in learning more about natural fibers, I do have an episode about natural fibers in the outdoor industry. So you can go back and check that out and just more details about the options that are available. If you can't answer this question, that's totally okay. But what exactly do you know about recycled polyester? Because I have really heard a mixed bag about how good it actually is, that using natural materials is always a better option, and that some companies also will produce things like the plastic bottles that turn into the recycled polyester. Yes. So I feel like there's a lot going on in the background.
Definitely. I think, having an air of caution whenever we see anything that markets itself as a green option or a more sustainable option is good, to have some hesitation there, because unfortunately there is a lot of greenwashing in the outdoor industry. Brands are capitalizing on consumers wanting to try and help minimize their impact within the outdoors. So a lot of recycled polyester, like you said, that does happen where a brand or a company they own might produce, plastic water bottles that they just convert into recycled polyester. So the water bottles were solely being produced for that fabric, which doesn't really make it, any better than just a virgin synthetic material. But there are other brands that are actually working to repurpose old gear, whether that's, taking the old garments, or I know brands like Patagonia are taking like old down or synthetic down and combining it with a lot of other older synthetic down in order to use it in new garments. Unfortunately, that just is a fraction of the synthetic material being used. So I would say, as we'll get into probably later in the episode, how we can determine which synthetic recycled material is actually legit and which of it is just further greenwashing in the industry.
Yeah, and that is a lot to ask of consumers to navigate all of that information. So if we can get a more like standardized regulation of verbiage and terminology and just like rules, that would be really great.
Absolutely.
But what part of the product life cycle, like we're kind of moving away from talking about specific materials at this point, but what part of the product life cycle do you think creates the most waste or environmental damage? Because I think because we are consumers, we think a lot about the gear when we have it in our possession and then of the afterlife. But do you think is that the biggest one?
I definitely think that's what's marketed, and I don't think that's an accident. It kind of puts the pressure on consumers to be responsible for the environmental impact. And while we do hold some responsibility, I think we need to remember that the companies that are producing these items also hold a massive amount of responsibility in figuring out how much environmental impact their gear is having. So I would say the means of production, especially like just manufacturing the materials, especially the synthetic ones like we talked about, definitely creates the most waste. If you think about what goes into like creating a single rain jacket, okay, like you have the energy used to drill for oil, you have creating that synthetic fiber, producing the garment, running a factory that can, sew it and then ship it off oftentimes to the other side of the globe. So all of that environmental impact can add up pretty quickly. And while there still is impact once we own the item, how we take care of it, how we wash it, how we dispose of it, I would say that a vast majority of the environmental impact comes from those means of production.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And like you said, maybe it depends a little bit on the type of material that is being produced and maybe the method of production. Like those things can potentially be reduced. But I do think that it's often pushed onto the consumer as like, this is your problem to deal with and you have an impact, when we should also be looking at bigger picture impacts along the way.
Yeah.
Something interesting that I learned from one of the guests I had previously, he is the CEO of Climate Neutral Certified, that certification. And he was saying that there are some studies, like they tried to measure the carbon emissions and the general greenhouse gas produced when a consumer owned a product, but it was too variable and they couldn't really measure it. And he was saying how it doesn't really matter unless you own that item for years and years and years, because the producer will always be producing more unless you have it your entire life, which is a good reminder. At least it was for me.
Definitely. It does not all fall on our shoulders for sure.
Yeah. I know we're focusing a lot on synthetics, but I do think it's a really important topic. And you mentioned earlier that it is just really, really integrated into a lot of our outdoor gear. So why do you think synthetics are kind of the go-to in the outdoor industry? And are there ways to curb the impact of those synthetics?
Yeah, I mean, put simply, synthetic material works really well. It's great at keeping us dry. It's good at keeping us warm. It's often easier and cheaper for brands to produce. If you think about drilling, it might be hard to comprehend, but somehow that is cheaper than, harvesting cotton or wool or down and things like that. But these conveniences definitely have their drawbacks. I mean, first and foremost, I think, like we've talked about, that as consumers, we have to understand that the weight of this responsibility just does not solely lie on our shoulders. And one way that we can try and curb the impact of synthetic materials as a consumer is really putting the pressure on companies about how they're producing these items. Like we said, so much of the recycled synthetic material is just sort of greenwashing. So putting the pressure on them, pressing them on their claims, and letting them know that, we won't stand for further greenwashing and capitalizing on our desire to do right by the planet. And while we do have some responsibility once the item is in our hands, as you were saying, it is quite minimal, so we can still care for it in a way that hopefully will release less microplastics, whether that's washing it in a microplastic bag or just caring for it properly, and also holding on to it for longer. So patching, sewing, making sure that the item is going to last longer will help keep it out of landfill. But the monumental changes are going to come from taking collective action and voicing our concerns to those who are producing these synthetic products, kind of voting with our dollar and forcing them to change the way that they're producing these garments.
Yeah, and I know that I didn't send you this question before, but what do you think is the best approach for a consumer to push for that type of collective action or industry change? Do you think it is just a simple boycott or refusal to buy those items, or are there other ways to go about that?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, voting with our dollar, whether that's not purchasing from a company because we really don't align with the actions they're taking, or supporting companies that we feel like are taking actions in the right direction. And honestly, just emailing customer service, pressing them on the claims they make. Sometimes you get a response more often than you think, especially if maybe you have an item of gear from that company, and just asking for specifics, because a lot of companies nowadays have a sustainability page, which on the surface is a step in the right direction. But if it's just full of, like vague claims, like we're reducing our synthetic materials, that doesn't really give us much to work with. So really seeing if there are any specifics, pressing them on that. And it may feel like we're just making a small impact for this company, but it's when multiple people do this, when we take collective action, that companies have to reevaluate and start changing. I would say that there's usually sometimes petitions as well on change.org is a large website that does this. And I have seen quite a few on there. If you just search environment or outdoor industry, that are petitions fighting for better terminology or better practices within the outdoor industry. So just checking back in on there and seeing if there's any petitions that you can add your name to that you align with.
Yeah, that's a great tip. And I'll add the link to that website in the show notes. So if you've never heard of it before, you can go and check it out. They have a lot of different types of petitions in there. Like you said, you can just kind of search for the type that you're looking for.
Definitely.
So even though individual action has its pros and cons, collective action can make a difference. And a lot of times, at least in my opinion, the longevity of your gear does matter a lot. So I do want to talk a little bit about gear and textile repair, and we can talk a little about recycling as well. But what are the current options for those types of things in the outdoor industry, and how do you think those aspects can be better integrated from the company perspective?
Yeah, I would say in recent years, there's been a huge surge when it comes to gear repair in the outdoor industry, which is awesome. Big name companies like Patagonia are offering gear repair for items, and I believe they'll also repair items that aren't even theirs. So if you have something that's Columbia or North Face, you can send that into them. As consumers, like many of us, are capable of repairing our gear on our own. I think sometimes we think outdoor gear is maybe a bit more scary, or we don't want to mess it up because usually it's expensive. But oftentimes, if we have a small rip or a tear, they can usually be fixed with a small patch or a few stitches. And we don't need to be a seamstress usually in order to sew something. But oftentimes there are also, materials that maybe we aren't experienced at sewing or patching, or just kind of don't know how to repair it. Thankfully, there are a plethora of companies out there who offer gear-specific repair within the outdoor industry. Some of them include, it's called Rugged Thread, Rainy Pass Repair, there's Repair Layer, Mountain Soles, and oftentimes your local gear shop will also either have its own repair section, or they'll be able to point you in the right direction for someone local who does gear-specific repair. In terms of integrating it more into the industry, I would love to see more brands offering gear repair for their items. Currently, most brands in the outdoors will just send you a new item if yours gets damaged, if it's under their warranty. And while that's good because then you have, a functioning piece of gear, it does just kind of perpetuate the idea that gear is disposable and any minor inconvenience means, oh, just throw it away. Let's get a new one. So I would love to see brands actually working on repairing their gear, making it last, rather than just sending us new items all the time and continuing the idea that we need new gear every single season, every single year.
Yeah, I agree. I have seen a lot larger push for repairability amongst producers, but I do think certain companies are potentially doing it better or more aggressively than others. But then you have pieces of gear that aren't functional anymore. They have lived out their life completely, and you can't even donate them or give them to a friend to use later on. I've heard of this intermittently about textile recycling or any type of material recycling. And I know there's some brands that do it just for their types of gear, like Sterling ropes for climbing ropes. I think they do. I could be wrong. I might be thinking of a different rope company, but one of the big rope companies I know, they recycle their ropes. What do you know about that type of specifically synthetic recycling when it comes to textiles?
Yeah, that can be really difficult because, like you said, if it's past the point of repair, we can't, just donate it to a local shelter or give it to a friend even. I know that it's called Ridwell. They recycle really hard to recycle items, and they're pretty good at ensuring that the items are separated. And they recycle everything from clothing to just other hard to recycle items like batteries or other items in our household that we just can't do. And they're based in Seattle. I'm not sure how far their spread is, like if you're able to get them up and down the West Coast or throughout the US. But I know in the Pacific Northwest, they are really great at ensuring that these items are properly recycled because we can't put them, in our curbside recycling. Or if we put them in the trash, then they're just going to end in landfill. So I would say that is good. And then there are also some artists out there who repurpose old gear and turn it into art or small items. So I know there's one artist who repurposes synthetic gear and makes like small bags or purses out of whatever is salvageable from them, or someone who uses old ropes and makes these really beautiful rugs out of them. So there are people working to try and, minimize that waste. And I would say local gear shops also sometimes have a way to recycle it. I know that ours has one for like old shoes that are past the point of use. They ensure that they get sent off properly and are disposed of in a more sustainable way than just tossing them in our trash.
Yeah, and I think we can push, obviously, for production changes for the steps in the life cycle of products before they get to us. But then kind of putting maybe more of your efforts into the afterlife of gear after you've tried to maintain it and repair it as best as you can, it is really important because that is something that is somewhat in your control. Like you said, sometimes there are a lot of local options that maybe you weren't aware of before. So kind of finding things within your community to keep things more locally based, I think is really cool. And I have heard of a couple other companies that I think accept donations of different types of gear. Like there's one that you can send your bike tubes to. I think they're in Colorado, Green Guru, and they make little bike bags out of those, which I thought was really awesome. And I think they might also do things out of old sails from sailboats.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And there's a climbing rope one as well that I have heard of called Crag Dog, and they make dog things out of ropes. And I think they're starting to branch into harnesses to make like skijoring harnesses out of old climbing harnesses, just to like,
nice,
because you don't need them as much for a safety aspect, which I thought was really innovative and cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Okay, so kind of shifting gears to something that I think is maybe the most impactful thing I think any consumer can do, and it is to reduce your consumption. And how do we kind of like move into that? You've mentioned a couple of times that sometimes in the outdoor industry, we kind of have this belief that we maybe need new gear for a new season or a new sport or something like that. And sometimes that's relevant. But how do you think we can start moving into a reduction of consumption?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, just taking a step back and asking ourselves, like, why? Why do we want this piece of gear? Is it because we actually need it, or are we just kind of being tricked by all these clever marketing tips to feel like we need, a new ski jacket every season? Sometimes, like you said, it's deemed totally necessary. Our old jacket is not useful and we need a new one. But if we just take a step back and take our time when purchasing an item, I think is also a great way to kind of begin reducing our consumption, especially if you're at a place right now where you are constantly purchasing new gear. If we take a step back and kind of think about it rather than making impulse buys, that's like the simplest way for us to begin noticing how often we're purchasing gear or asking ourselves those difficult questions of why we would want that gear in the first place.
Yeah, that interruption of purchasing, I think, is really important. Rethinking your purchases to correlate with the reduction. So say we got to a point that we deemed a piece of gear necessary, or maybe even some piece of gear that you've had for a really long time has reached its end of life with you, and so you need to replace it. How do you recommend people go about making a more ethical choice in their upcoming purchase?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing we can do, and something I'm a huge supporter of, is trying to find the gear used first. Obviously, there are some items that we probably would rather not buy used. I know for me, as a big runner, I buy new running shoes. That's one thing that I am okay buying brand new. But for the most part, I try and find my other gear used. So places like REI Good and Used, I know there's Patagonia Worn Wear, places like eBay, Facebook Marketplace, or even just your local thrift store or local gear shop often has what you're looking for. Usually it's cheaper too. And one way that buying used gear can be a little more helpful is, like we said, if we're being a little more patient. Maybe you won't find it the first time you're looking for it, but if you can afford to wait, a few weeks and we put an alert on, I know you can for like Patagonia Worn Wear and REI Good and Used, they'll notify you when it comes in. You'll be able to purchase it. You know that it's still going to be high quality. It's not going to be, deemed unusable if you purchase it from there. And it's often cheaper too, which is, making it more accessible for people to get in the outdoors. But if we can't find an item used, or we just really want a new item, a few things that we can be conscious of as consumers includes looking for those sustainability claims that we were talking about. Looking for like very clear and concise goals rather than just vague greenwashing buzzwords, because anyone can say we're sustainable. There's no company or organization that is verifying a lot of the claims that brands are making. So very clear and concise goals. Like I said, third-party certifications like fair trade, or as you were saying, like the climate neutral certified. Also, repurposed or recycled materials being used. Again, as we talked about, pushing into those claims and figuring out, okay, is this actually recycled material or is it just more greenwashing? And again, like we said, just not rushing into the purchase if we can, making sure that we are buying an item that really aligns with what we're trying to put our money towards, and getting one that we truly want. So the more we think about the item, the more we're likely to make a quality purchase, and the more likely we are to take care of that gear for years to come.
Yeah, that transparency piece is really key. And I love that you're putting a big focus on taking your time, because I've been in that position before where I feel like I really need something, and then I kind of dwelled on it for a while, maybe shopped around here and there, but then realized that I didn't really need it. I just kind of wanted it in that moment.
Yeah.
So that can also happen, which is great.
Definitely.
Since we're kind of talking about ethical gear purchases, not necessarily just sustainable, because you also mentioned that there is a social aspect. I feel like a lot of times in previous episodes that I've talked about gear and kind of making these types of choices, we have mentioned a lot of certifications specific to environmental sustainability. So are there any third-party certifications that people can be on a lookout that would tie more into social responsibilities?
Yeah, the largest one is going to be fair trade certified. They're kind of leading the way in terms of production of clothing or other textiles, and really ensuring that the workers are being paid and treated fairly and justly. A lot of brands will say that they, pay their employees in different countries minimum wage, which on the surface we think, oh, that's great. They're at least paying them the minimum wage, But that could mean something absolutely dismal in another country where the minimum wage isn't necessarily a livable wage. So fair trade makes sure that they are able to have livable and just wages for all of their employees. And companies like Good On You is a website that is third party, and they analyze all clothing brands. Any major brand you should be able to find on there. And they look into sustainable and ethical and animal claims. So, if a company is using down or wool, ensuring that animals, people, and the environmental responsibility, they kind of just analyze all of those claims. They lay it out in a really easy way to ensure that we can make the most educated purchases possible.
Since you mentioned it, the animal aspect, I would say that I am a relatively outspoken vegan, so I have really kind of pushed myself into learning about those types of certifications, but just for the sake of sharing types of certifications you can look for, because those are really consumer-facing, easy to recognize, and easy to align with. So what would you say are some of the top and most relevant animal rights certifications, or like animal protection, maybe, certifications?
I know that there are like PETA approved logos on certain brands, as well as I think it's like fair or ethical down or ethical wool are terms that will be used, as well as even just like the vegan trademark for someone who's looking to avoid animal-based products in their gear. But at the same time, I can't think of other major ones, which is why I really love turning people to like the Good On You, is because they kind of go in and do much more research than probably the average consumer would on these companies. Even if the company doesn't have anything listed on their website, they'll interview people at the company to ask them, how are they harvesting this wool? How are they getting this down? And basically putting whatever they're doing for the consumer to see so that we can make more educated choices. Because unfortunately, there aren't a lot of certifications specific to that, especially for companies who are using, down or wool versus I know leather, there's usually much more certifications, but some outdoor brands obviously use leather, but it's such a small amount that they usually don't even bother with certifications, unfortunately.
Yeah, I feel like you're saying with the leather and then maybe the wool and down would be the most relevant to the outdoor industry. But the Good On You website, I think, is a great resource, especially because there are a lot of really responsible smaller companies in the outdoor industry that maybe they're not to a point in their growth that they would, one, be able to afford a third-party certifier, but they are still doing like responsible production to some extent. So yeah, it is cool that that website exists for sure. That is a really good resource just right off the bat, but what other resources do you recommend to people that want to learn more about gear production or the environmental impact of their gear?
Yeah, I would say that the Textile Exchange is another great resource, and they really kind of dive into like the environmental impacts of clothes and just kind of a much deeper dive into kind of what we talked about today, how synthetic materials affect the planet, how the clothes that we're wearing and the gear that we're wearing is affecting these wild spaces that we're exploring. And they kind of cover everything within the fashion industry, which obviously includes a lot of the gear that we wear. Another resource I would say would be the Outdoor Industry Association. They have just a plethora of information centered around climate action in the outdoor industry. And they do talk about, means of production for our gear and kind of what those aspects look like. And it's very centered around the outdoor industry. So if you're looking for something a little more specific to gear, I would say, the Outdoor Industry Association would probably be your best bet for learning more.
Okay, awesome. Well, I will make sure that I link to all of those resources in the show notes. So if any of those things interest you, you can go and check those out later. But with that, how can people learn more about you and your work, and how can they contact you?
The best way to contact me or just keep up with the work that I'm doing or writing pieces that I publish would be through my website, which is mindfulpeaks.com. And there's a form to contact me through there, or you can just simply send an email to marie@mindfulpeaks.com.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for being here, Marie. And I hope that everyone else found this information just as valuable as I did.
Thank you so much for having me, Meg. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. And if you like what you hear, let me know. Leave a review and be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. New content has begun to appear on the Outdoor Minimalist Patreon. Head over to theoutdoorminimalist.com for more information about our listener support and patron exclusives. You can still find me on Instagram at outdoor.minimalist.book. Follow there for daily updates, other educational resources, and to help build an outdoor community with a shared goal to create a better outdoor space as we recreate.